Good afternoon. In this section of Acts, we have a record of the first Christian martyr. Stephen is the first account we have of someone dying as a result of following Jesus. And it follows a rising tide of opposition that the church have faced in the book of Acts. Acts, you might know, if you've followed along in the series, you'll remember, is a history of the early church. And what you see in this story is that there is a growing persecution against the church. And it comes particularly from the religious establishment of the day. It begins as vocal opposition. So in the early chapters you get disagreement, it moves to hostility, it moves to threats. And then we begin to see the Christians are imprisoned for what they are declaring about Jesus, what they believe about Jesus. And now as we reach this point in Acts chapter 7, Stephen is killed for his faith. I need to be honest with you. Today is a hard sermon. It's a hard sermon because at one level this is a tragic event. What you see is a mob killing. Stephen is brutally stoned, and that of course is a hard thing then for us to look at. But it's also hard because the passage makes us face two realities. It first of all makes us face the reality of opposition. That if you are a Christian, it will mean in some level, some kind of opposition. It always has done, and it always will be. But then it also brings us close to need to face the reality of death. And that is true whatever you believe here this afternoon. And we know that there are a whole mix of different things that people will believe. If you're a Christian, if you're not, death is a reality, nevertheless, that we all must face. And so this is a passage that it makes us look at, face the reality of opposition and the reality of death, but it gives us the key to facing both as well. The key to facing both. So we'll look at the reality of opposition, the reality of death, and then the key to facing them both. So here's the first thing, the reality of opposition. I want us to see a couple of things about the way the opposition against Stephen happens. Let me show you the cause, first of all. Why does this happen? And it's quite simple. The cause is the sermon that Stephen gives. It's what he said is what gets him into such terrible trouble with the religious authorities. So he's been brought before them to defend what he's teaching about Jesus, which is what the church is teaching and believing about Jesus. And it's obvious in chapter 6 that there's some shenanigans going on. They're trying to frame him. So we read that false witnesses are called, people are giving false evidence, there's a stitch-up going on. But in response, Stephen gives a remarkable sermon in chapter 7. Alex moved right to the end of the sermon, which you don't have the luxury of doing this afternoon. But he jumped us right to the end of it. Let me just encourage you to go back and read it. It is an incredible sermon. I'll refer to some parts of it during this afternoon. It is encouraging, it is rich, it is deep, it's a powerful retelling of the history of God's people. But what I want us to focus on is why it provokes such a violent reaction. And we read that the priests came together and they started saying, in chapter 6, you find this in verse 13, basically they say that Stephen, this fellow, he never stops speaking against this holy place, against the temple. He says that this Jesus is going to make the temple unnecessary. It is going to make the priesthood unnecessary. Now, whilst they try and mischaracterize some of what he says, they are absolutely right in those things. It is what Stephen was saying. It is the gospel message of the church, which was this. It was that Jesus is now the way a person meets and encounters God. That is how somebody comes to God. And so the temple, it wasn't needed in the way that it had done previously. And that's what begins to draw out this violent response that we see at the end of the sermon. Look at chapter 7 and verse 54. When they heard these things, they were enraged and they ground their teeth at him. They are furious. But it's the next thing he says that tips them over. At the end of the speech, we're told Stephen looks up into heaven and he says this, verse 56. Behold, I see the heavens opened and the Son of Man standing at the right hand of God. And that is what does it. That is what tips them over into murderous rage. They just could not stand it. Look at the response, 57. They cried out with a loud voice. They stopped their ears. They rushed together to him. Then they cast him out of the city and they stoned him. Now, what was it? What was it about those words that tipped them over, that provoked this kind of reaction? What is it about what Stephen said that draws out such fury and hatred? Well, if you look as he moves to the end of his speech, he ends it with an accusation. To this group of priests, he says, "You never kept the law of God." Let me read exactly what he says. Verse 51, "You stiff-necked people, uncircumcised in heart and ears, you always resist the Holy Spirit, as your fathers did, so do you. Which of the prophets did your fathers not persecute? And they killed those who announced beforehand the coming of the righteous one, whom you have now betrayed and murdered. You who received the law as delivered by angels and did not keep it." See, here's what he says. Stephen says to this group of priests, he says, you talk about the law of God. You never cease to speak about the law of God, but you've never kept it. You've not kept the law of God. And that's when they get mad. That's when we read they get furious, they gnash their teeth. They were so angered because Stephen really says, all you've tried to do has not brought you to God. Everything that you've sought to do, he says, it hasn't got you to the place where you wanted it to get. He says, you haven't kept the law. You haven't kept the law in a way that it will bring you to God. It's failed to open heaven for you, and that strikes so deep because it cuts at everything they held dear. To a group of priests, it undermines their identity, it undermines their status. More than that, it undermines their sense of goodness, their sense of what made them better. He really says, your religious morality, it hasn't got you to heaven. It hasn't got you to where you hoped it would. And it unleashed this murderous rage. Because did you hear that Stephen talks about God's righteous one? He says that God has sent his righteous one, the righteous one that they murdered, that they turned against. Now what does that mean? What's he saying? He's saying that all of the priesthood, he's saying that all of the sacrifices, that following religious observance could never get you in. It doesn't matter how much you pray, it doesn't matter how much and how strict you follow religious observances, you can even be a priest, he says, and still fail to be righteous, still fail to get your heart right, still find that the way to God is closed. But then here's what Stephen says, there is another way that heaven can be opened. There is another way. Because God has sent one to do what we never could do. His righteous one. Jesus. And Jesus came to do what we could not. You see, to get heaven opened, to get in, the Christian faith says you have to be perfect. But because we can't be, Jesus comes as God's righteous one and he does it for us. He is righteous for us. And with that, he throws open the door of heaven. In verse 56, that's what Stephen says. He says, behold, I see the heavens opened. Through faith in him, it's now the way to God is open, and anyone can go in. But that message is like dynamite. You present a message like this, you present Jesus like this, and you will find it always polarizes. It always polarizes because it always draws opposition because it challenges so deeply. It challenges at so many levels. It messes with how we think things work at so many levels. And because it always draws opposition, let me just show you a comfort from these verses too. See, persecution, if you like, is built to a crescendo. It's built to the highest sacrifice that somebody has made yet in the church. They've given their life in following Jesus. So let me give you a comfort here. Persecution is not due to a lack of control. Here's what I mean. Why is it significant that Stephen sees Jesus in heaven? Well, you can answer that this way, it's a fact. And Luke, who is the author, is keen to record eyewitness accounts of the events exactly as it happened. So it's factual. But it's also a declaration. Because right back at the beginning of Acts, maybe you remember this, it begins with the ascension of Jesus. It begins with the risen Jesus ascending up into heaven. Now, I won't go back into it now, but really, what is the ascension? It's a sign that Jesus is now in the place from which he rules and reigns. He's in the place of authority. He's at the right hand of God the Father, and right now, he is reigning and ruling. Now just think about that here. Think about it at this moment. Here you have Jesus appearing in a vision to Stephen in heaven. In heaven. Why? To show that even at a point like this, he is still ruling and reigning. He is still in control. Even when Stephen is being stoned, Jesus is still on the throne. He is still the one ruling. Do you know what that means? It means even when the darkness closes in, even in the darkness where we don't understand, Christ is ruling. Even where it appears that things are going wrong, he is still the king. I think that's one of the reasons the book of Acts is such a gift to us, because it offers a perspective. See, we can look back, and because we can read the story, we can see all the ways Jesus was working that the early church couldn't see as clearly. Because it's tempting to think, isn't it? Jesus is ruling and reigning. Let me show you a time when Jesus rules and reigns. It's like thousands are converted. Oh, then he's on the throne. Look at him in triumph, in victory. Then he's ruling and reigning. But somehow, when stuff like this goes down, it's far easier. It's far harder, isn't it, to think that Jesus is still in control. But this says, oh, well, no. No, Jesus is still ruling for the good of his people, even when we cannot fathom the mystery of his ways. And this, I think, this is speculation, but I wonder if it's why we get the detail of Saul. Did you hear it? Just tucked away in verse 58, you get the description. It's a chilling description, actually. Verse 58, then they cast him out of the city, they stoned him, and the witnesses laid down their garments at the feet of a young man named Saul. Now, if you know anything that's coming in the book of Acts, you know this is the one who's going to change his name to Paul. This is the person who probably has done more to spread the message of the gospel than anyone else in the history of Christianity. But right now, he's in the mob. He's in the mob. He's standing by as Stephen, a follower of Jesus, is being killed. I wonder, it's as if to say, if Jesus is on the throne, if Jesus is ruling, then he can work in greater ways than we can possibly imagine. He can do more than we could possibly think, even with the very people who are casting the stones on Stephen's head. See, opposition is real. Opposition is real. We have to face the reality of that, but Jesus is still on the throne. See, look, face the opposite reality of opposition. Here's the next thing. It makes us face the reality of death. Death which will come to us all. It might not be like Stephen's. It probably won't be, but it will come. And whenever you see a death, whenever you have to face a death, it makes you face the reality. The reality of death, not just as an abstract, but as something real. I was amazed by how many conversations I had after the death of the Queen. I'm a pastor, and it's more likely that people speak to me about those kind of things, I guess, over the years. But I had more conversations, and I spoke to more people about death than I ever have done at any other point. But that's what happens. When death comes near, we have to look at it. But we find that incredibly difficult. There's an anthropologist called Ernest Becker, and he conducted a huge study on death in the 1970s. And it was really significant in terms of understanding how humans view death. And in it, he says this, there's a point where he says, the idea of death, the fear of it, haunts the human animal like nothing else. Do you hear that? We fear death. Death haunts us. Now, if you begin to ask the question, well, why is that? Why does it do that? I think there are many reasons. But in the West, here is, I think, one of the most significant. Because death is a reality that most of us are totally unprepared for. In fact, we live in the first culture designed specifically to obscure the reality of death. We do everything we can to make death seem distant. Even though none of us can avoid it, we rarely speak of it. Do you know actually the title that Becker gave the book that he published? He called it The Denial of Death. We want to do all we can to avoid even thinking about it. And that is, I think, because for years and years, our modern culture has basically been secular. Now, I think there's strong arguments that that's probably beginning to change. But for years, most people were told that there is no God, there is no supernatural, there is no soul, there is no transcendent. What exists is the material. It is the here and the now. So if you want meaning, if you want purpose, if you want fulfillment, focus exclusively on the here and now. You'll find everything you need in the world right here. And if you believe that, do you see why death presents such a problem? It's because death eradicates all of those things. Death removes every single one of them. All the things that you look to in order to make sense of life are taken. See, a secular world only has hope in the here and now, but death removes the here and now. It takes away all of those things, and so death terrifies us because it's the utter end of everything that we're told matters, of everything that we think matters, and it floods us with fear. Death haunts our steps, and any reminder of it we want to drown out, we want to cut off, we want to deny, which makes us more unprepared for death than any other people in history. And at the same time, also more skeptical about what lies beyond than almost any other people in history. See, my guess is that you read something like this, and for some of you it will seem to push the absurd. You read of Jesus, you read of heaven, you read of the possibility of something after death, and you just think any suggestion like that, anything that there is more than the material, it just seems absolutely ridiculous to you. But can I say this? The passage may be unique, but we're being shown how thin the veil is. What do I mean, how thin the veil is? Well, I came across a fascinating book last year, that just was released last year, in fact, called After. It was written by a professor called Dr. Bruce Grayson, and he's a psychiatrist. He's been an academic for 45 years. He's not a Christian. In fact, he was brought up a hard-nosed skeptic. They're his own words. But early in his career, he came across someone they'd had a near-death experience. And something in it he couldn't explain. And he found nor could he explain it or ignore it. And so it shook him. In fact, he said nothing in his whole background, in his scientific training up to that point, had prepared him to deal with a full frontal assault on his worldview. This is a young man at the beginning of his career. And so for the next 45 years, he's researched rigorously, he's explored, he's applied scientific methods as he's tried to understand what near-death experiences are. And do you know what he decided? What he concludes after all of those years is that there's something more. He says this, let me quote from him: "The decades of research have convinced me that near-death experiences are quite real and quite profound in their impact, and are in fact important sources of spiritual growth and insight. They matter to all of us in what they tell us about death and dying, and more important, about life and living." That's remarkable. But here, let me kind of paraphrase. Here's what he says: the veil is thin. And you know what Acts 7 shows you? The veil is thin. And just because you cannot explain something doesn't mean you can ignore it. In fact, that is the opposite of a rational mindset. Maybe you can't get your head around what you see in this passage, about the things I'm going to share in a moment, but the suggestion that there is more than life, let me tell you this, ignoring it won't help it. It won't help you make sense of it, and you cannot ignore this forever. Nobody can. But if your response every time is to turn and run, if it's to flee from this, if it's to stop your ears, you will never be prepared. Ignoring it never works. So hey, maybe you say, well listen, if you want me to face it, then give me some hope. Give me some hope. If I'm supposed to face this without despair, without it destroying me, how do I face the reality of death? How do I face the reality of opposition if I'm a Christian? Well, here's the final thing the passage shows us. there is a key to facing both of them. And it's this: you have to remove the fear. And when the fear is removed, you find you can be courageous in life and in death. But the way to have the fear removed is by seeing Jesus as your righteous one. And when you see Jesus as your righteous one, let me show you how this first of all will help you face death. Like I said, I think Acts 7 in many ways is unique. Stephen gets a unique vision of Christ before he dies. That isn't a promise that is made for every Christian as they face death, but listen. The circumstances may be unique, but the substance is not. We are being pointed towards a reality that is true for every single Christian. One of the promises that Jesus makes, very close to his death, recorded in John's Gospel, when he gives the disciples a glimpse of the future that is theirs, he gives a preview of the reality that can be true for every Christian. And in John 14, this is the promise Jesus makes. He says, "Let not your hearts be troubled. Believe in God. Believe also in me. In my Father's house are many rooms. If it were not so, would I have told you that I go to prepare a place for you? And if I go and prepare a place for you, I will come again and will take you to myself, that where I am, you may be also." Look at Acts 7. And what is Acts 7 if it's not Jesus saying, "I promise. I promise." Jesus appears to Stephen as he faces his death, and as he stands, as if to beckon Stephen in, as if to say, "I passed through death. I passed through death and I'm now waiting for you. I'm at the destination I promised I would be. And I'm here with open arms to welcome you in." Do you see how that addresses so much of the fear? So much of the unknown, because Jesus says, "I'm the one who's gone before. And I'm the one who now waits for you. And I'm the one who will now welcome you." I think he gives an anchor to stabilize us in death and in life. I've been trying to figure out what we can learn from the response of many people of those conversations when the Queen died. And it wasn't until I read an interview with the comedian, David Baddiel, who's a writer as well, this week, and I thought, that's what I was trying to scrabble for. And what he said, he doesn't believe in God, he's an atheist. But in this interview he said, "I really wish I could believe in God. I want to believe in God." And he said, "I wish there was a God because I'm desperate for that comfort. I'm desperate because at heart I'm a wailing load of need like all human beings." He said, I'm desperate for the comfort that God brings. And he recognizes that need for God. And any denial of that in anyone, in his words, he says, it's just macho posturing. It's just macho posturing. But here was the thing that really turned a light bulb on for me. He said it was in the death of the Queen that longing was intensified. And here was his idea. He said, in the Queen, when the Queen died, we saw the nation's desire for God. But what we'd done, we placed the godlike desires that we have on the person of the Queen. And in the person of the Queen, we had a desire for permanence, for stability, for someone who somehow could offer comfort in life because they never seemed to change. Someone who even could offer a kind of deathlessness because they seemed to go on and on and on. And yet here's what we found with the Queen. She was not divine. She's just like the rest of us. But do you see what Stephen shows us here? In
Jesus, there is a constant in life who remains a constant in death. Do you see that? In Jesus, there is a consistent anchor in life and a hope in death. What did Stephen devote his life to? Jesus. And who now greets Stephen in death? Jesus. He turns in verse 59 and he says to Jesus, Jesus, do you now receive my spirit? You are the one I've lived for in life. You are the one in whose name this life is now being poured out. But Jesus, you now greet me in death. The same anchor, the same hope. Don't you see? Christ is the only thing that death cannot remove but will only enhance. He is the one thing that will become more glorious in death. And when you see that, when you take it down into you, it can remove the fear of death to such an extent. You can see it like sleep. Like sleep. Did you notice the description there in verse 60? And falling to his knees, he cried out with a loud voice, Lord, do not hold this sin against them. And when he had said this, he fell asleep. Why is, of all the images, as the stones are falling on him, as his life is ebbing away, in the midst of one of the most violent deaths you can imagine, it says he falls asleep. So why that image? Why sleep? Here's why. When you lay down and sleep, you do so knowing that you will wake to a new day. It is predictable. It is inevitable. It is unstoppable. Jesus makes the same true of death. To close your eyes in death as a believer is predictable, inevitable, and unstoppable, that you will wake to see his face. It's why we sing, and when I close my eyes in death, I will wait to see his face. You say, I wish I had that confidence. I long for that kind of confidence. Do you know how you get it? You have to know that sin has been dealt with. The fear of death is because we know it harms, it destroys, it removes, it disrupts. It has poison. There is a point in the New Testament, in 1 Corinthians 15, that says the poison, the sting of death is sin. The sting of death is sin, but Jesus on the cross, he is the righteous one who's dealt with sin. He is the righteous one who's taken it away, and so now we can say, 1 Corinthians 15, verse 54, death is swallowed up in victory. Oh death, where is your victory? Oh death, where is your sting? John Newton wrote a whole hymn on the death of Stephen. And then one of the verses goes like this. It says, may we, by faith, perceive thee thus, dear Saviour, ever near to us. This fight our peace through life shall keep. And death be feared no more than sleep. And you know, the courage to face death is actually the courage to live life. This is massively practical. It will help remove fear in life, and this is what I'll finish. See, if the ultimate fear is gone, if there really is now nothing to fear in death, it gives an incredible confidence in life, a boldness, a poise. Knowing Jesus like this means that the fear of others can be removed, even the fear of opposition. One of the things that's so amazing in these verses is the way Stephen is described physically, his demeanour. He was facing persecution, and they, his persecutors, are described as being out of control. It is raging, it is gnashing of teeth. But look at Stephen, he is calm. He is at peace, and they are astonished. Here is Stephen talking with extreme boldness, laying it out, not being afraid of anything, not even of death. How does he do that? Well, there's a unique description of Stephen. You don't find it anywhere else in the Bible. And I think it's an easy one to misunderstand. But did you notice it in chapter 6 and verse 15? Gazing at him, all who sat in the council saw that his face was like the face of an angel. I think we're so messed up in terms of our description of things as angelic that immediately you think, well, what does it mean for his face to be like the face of an angel? In the Bible, angels are messengers of God. They dwell with God. And as such, they share something with glory, which is why when you read of an appearance of an angel, you nearly always find that it's accompanied by light. It reflects something of the glory of God because they are beings who dwell in the presence of God. I think what we're being told here is that Stephen is the same. Here is a man who dwelt in Jesus close to God and reflects by the Spirit something of the glory of being in his presence. Stephen has had the audacity to look up and say, I see the heavens opened. Stephen acts like he has access, doesn't he? Like he is a person who is already there, like he really believed that he could stand before the face of God, like heaven really had been opened for him and he really had been welcomed in. And if you know that, when you know that, when you know you can stand before the face of God, if you know that Jesus has granted you that kind of access, you don't have to be afraid of anything else. You don't have to be afraid of anyone else. It can bring you boldness and courage. And a deep freedom actually to love other people with a depth and a passion that is impossible in any other way. As the stones fall on him, the last thing he says in verse 60, Lord, do not hold this sin against them. Who does that remind you of? Trial by false witnesses, strung up, his life taken away as an act of injustice. And yet, even in his last moments, praying, Father, forgive. On the cross, Jesus forgives his murderers. And now, filled with the Spirit of Jesus, Stephen does the same. You see, on the cross, Jesus made enemies like us his friends. He said, come and enter in. Heaven can be opened for you. The fear can be removed. And we can now live life and we can face death again. Let me pray for us. May we by faith perceive thee thus, this Saviour ever near to us. This fight our peace through life shall lead, and death be feared no more than sleep. Thus they who in the Lord confide though foes assault on every side, cannot be moved or overthrown, for Jesus makes their cause his own.